Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. You're with Future Sense here on Bay FM with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Thanks for joining us here on the radio broadcast. If you're listening live on air this morning on Monday morning, the 13th of April, or possibly online on bayfm.org, or certainly our edited podcast, which comes out within 24 hours of this broadcast, and you can access that through futuresense.it or your normal platforms. And we're going to range into current affairs and COVID-19 now, and some observations that we've come across this week.
Yeah, I thought we'd have a chat about the media. And in general, when we talk about this global value shift that's underway, the old systems that were designed by the old paradigm and their failure to cope with the complexity of current life is a key aspect of the discussion. And of course, we've been seeing gradually over many years now the slow failure of things like our political systems, who no longer be presenting us with the best leaders that we might possibly have in the moment. You know, our economic system has been periodically crashing for much of its life, really, but those crashes have been getting bigger and more impactful. And of course, many have been predicting the big one anytime soon, and it's very interesting that this whole economic reaction to COVID-19 has been looking very much like a deliberately chosen, controlled crash, and that, of course, is shaping everything around what we're doing internationally in relation to the virus. Just thinking about mainstream media in general, some of the issues that we face are, of course, sensationalism, and this is very much tied to the old economic system where our media needs to earn money from advertising and therefore wants to sound like the most interesting and the most urgent every time they make an announcement, so that you'll tune in and hear the ads at the same time so they can get paid.
Not sure if interesting, not that it's a very good word, interesting, although we use it all a lot, whether interesting is actually the word that they're, I think, the glamour of and the almost the fashion of. I showed you a picture before of people with masks. You know, they're doing these sort of fashionable masks now. Like, it's almost like we're beyond what's interesting. We're in a space where what's new and glamorous and weird and I can't find the word I'm looking for. But you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, it's
I don't know what I'm saying.
It's tied into the basic motivators around the old value system and wanting to be the best, but to be at the top of the pile, to be the most attractive, to be the most whatever.
Well, we're seeing some bizarre behaviour in America, particularly reported. A number of people are talking about that. Just some weird things that people are doing out there. I don't have an example in front of me. It just sort of occurred to me, but that sort of almost the last gasp of the empire is a kind of craziness, like Rome and the lead pipes.
It is. I mean, things are running to an extreme. In previous shows, I've used this analogy of a combustion engine that is nearing its end of life, and as the parts wear down, the friction within the engine actually decreases because the parts are wearing down. So there's a little bit more looseness in the engine, which means the parts can actually move faster, and so it's like the engine has a last blast. It's at its highest level of performance just before it actually blows a seal completely and fails. And that same dynamic, I think, is very relevant to the industrial age, that the engine itself is kind of running out of control and starting to scream. And we're seeing all of these extreme things, and those things are a precursor to the failure of the system entirely. And that's going to play out, of course, over the next sort of 10 to 15 years.
And all of that is very well reflected in mainstream media now.
Well, I think so.
It's just like a perfect mirror of the superficiality even of current socio-cultural life on the planet, especially in our supposed democracies.
Yeah. And reporting itself, media reporting, seems to have become shallower. So much of it is simply about repeating things sourced from other media agencies without actually looking into them or checking to see if the information is correct, or for perhaps even investigating it further.
Well, we've seen the closing down in Australia of the AAP, Reuters, which has provided a fairly independent news source for many outlets, and that's now closing down. So we're seeing a paucity of real investigative journalism now on the planet generally.
Yeah, I think
in our media.
That's been coming a long time, hasn't it? And of course, we've got the avalanche of information that comes to social media, where everybody has a radio station these days, basically, and a TV station, and they can publish whatever they want from whatever particular value system that they're living by. And so we're getting full spectrum. We're getting a lot, particularly at the moment, a lot of extreme conspiracy theories coming out. And the conspiracy thing is very interesting because it's very much tied to the old paradigm's way of managing information and its way of seeking success. And it's fair to say that to the old paradigm, I'm talking about the modern scientific industrial paradigm, that information is knowledge, and knowledge provides power. And therefore, if you are seeking power, then it's advantageous for you to actually withhold knowledge and perhaps even distort knowledge to put other people off the track of success, right? And that's something that's built into the system, and we've seen that play out over many, many years. And of course, layer 5, this modern paradigm, it also has a built-in tendency to want to break the rules, because as we go through the whole spiral of human evolution, it's the communal systems where the moral structures are formed. And that's because when we live together in community closely, we have to agree on what's okay and what's not okay. And when we break out of those communal value systems into the individual value systems, it's a kind of scramble to see what you can do without following the rules now, and of course, science, really, the whole scientific process came out of that from the agricultural era, where we had the sort of strict religious rule sets. And then all of a sudden science came along, and you can actually go out there and search for the information and find the truth yourself.
Because that's all driven by frustration, isn't it, on an emotional level, that change. And you can imagine being locked down for 1,500 years, one way or the other, living in that span of time, going like, I'm frustrated, I need to actually explore something here. We can make something better, we can do something more. Yeah. And we've seen the result of that, many wonderful results on the planet in the age of the Industrial Revolution. And many new problems, of course, have been formed, which is how the model works.
It's how evolution works, and it's all a natural process. Like, there's no right or wrong here. And what we're seeing now is the flip side of that, where we've had the wildness and the breaking of rules and the exploration, the exploitation, and now that's running to an extreme, and people are saying, well, hang on a minute, we need a set of rules here. We've got to come together and work together. So it's the whole thing just in reverse, and that's perfectly normal too. This is the way evolution works.
When you're talking about the media, it occurs to me too that there is just so much out there, as you're alluding to. We'll talk about a little bit about conspiracy theories you're just about to. But I always remember years ago here in the local council elections in the 90s, excuse me, where we were battling against the installation of Club Med, that French organisation which bought some land and wanted to create a Club Med down on the beach, and we protested and we defeated it in the end. But I always remember Councillor Rhonda Ellis, who was in council at that time, who stood up and did a speech on that day. We presented a petition. In fact, I handed the petition to the mayor at that time, 3,000 signatures. And she stood up and said, the fringe is taking over the carpet. In other words, yes, you might think we're crazies out here, but we are actually taking over. We're actually making the law here. And the other part of that which people pointed out to me, is that the fringe dwellers and the fringe information, conspiracy theories that dwells on the outlying areas of conventional society, is actually in some ways encouraged by the hegemony of the time, because it makes it look more solid and stable in the centre when the fringe is made to seem really crazy. And I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. Not to say that there isn't a lot of crazy stuff out there, because there is, and yet there's also pieces of truth which I think we're missing clues that do exist in some of these ideas about what's actually happening that many of us should pay some attention to. Could pay attention to.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to think about how the value system, which has driven the modern era, has really given birth to all of these problems.
Yeah.
And this is the way evolution works: is a new value system comes along and it solves all the problems, radically, and then so we start transitioning to and living by this new value system, and then over time, because of the growing complexity of the world and the growing complexity that we make as human beings by inventing new devices and connecting in different ways. Mean that we can't solve those problems as well anymore, and so we have to go through this whole process again, and we're just on the back end of the problem producing era, or the problem producing time within
we're recognising
the
the problems now, aren't we? We're already actually seeing the problems,
yeah.
And this COVID-19 crisis, I think, is really giving a strong relief for many people on the planet who've got that much time now to look at things, feel things in themselves, be with themselves or with a select few, and actually have to consider, is this the world we want? Is this world working now?
Yeah. And one of the beauties of the whole, the perfection of the whole system is that it doesn't matter really what the old paradigm tries to do now. Everything they do, which is birthed by the old way of thinking, is going to basically drive the change, which is a really interesting concept to ponder. And with the Layer 5 value system, I think in particular the way that it communicates and manages information, what's often most important is actually what you're not hearing, because it's very selective. It wants to produce the best image so that it can be successful, and so there's always something that's not being said. And particularly at this time, I think it's important to look for those things that aren't being said, because some of them are terribly, terribly obvious, but they're still not being said. And
some of them are suspicious enough to be given some air, some weight in discussion.
Yeah. And by definition, the old paradigm way of managing information means that it's managed, right? It's not just passed on. It's not displayed transparently. It is managed. It's massaged, and it's presented in a very careful way with an agenda.
Or it's removed from broadcast, as we've seen with a number of pieces that claim to be sort of outside of the parameters of YouTube or other platforms.
Exactly. I mean, that's a pandemic of its own
at
the moment, isn't it? Censorship on social media.
And talk to us about the incidents with London Real, for example.
Yeah, so London Real, if you're not familiar with it, it's a podcast run by a guy called Byron, who's an American based in London, and I've only really cottoned onto it within the last couple of years, but it's been around quite a while. I think it grew out of like a business coaching.
Yes, it's very much a business coaching, physical prowess, intellectual business prowess, money making, and so forth. It's a very sophisticated operation by the look of it. And clearly has something like 2 million views a month, something like that. Quite a large number of views. Yeah, I saw a video, just a piece to camera that Byron Rose did just very recently. Watched it this morning, and he did say that London Real was born also out of recognition that we weren't getting the full story from mainstream media, and that there was more to be said, more to be told. Well, good on him. But he's come up with some problems, though, because he did an interview just a few days ago with David Icke. Many of you would know he's a conspiracy theorist and quite a radical character, been around for many, many years, talking about all sorts of pretty out there stuff. Yeah. What do we think about that? Having watched the video. I think you've got to bear in mind that Brian's been going through his own personal transformation, which he's gone from being a very, very driven Layer 5 kind of a character, maybe exiting Layer 5 because he was very much around sort of personal improvement as well. Yeah. But then he's shifted noticeably in the last year or two, heading towards Layer 6. He visited Peru. He did. He drank some ayahuasca in I think it was in Costa Rica. Costa Rica. Yeah, right. Anyway, what's happened is that YouTube has censored and taken down his interview with David Icke. And I did watch, I think you watched the David Icke I watched it. Piece as well. He's an interesting character. I've always been very, very wary of him generally too, because he's a bit all over the place. But a lot of that was coherent enough and worth considering, wasn't it? It was the best
the best interview with David Icke I've seen. No doubt about that. I certainly don't, I don't support everything
Subscribe
that he
to everything he says.
Some of it is still definitely fringe opinion at best.
Absolutely. Yeah.
However, a lot of what he said is fair commentary of the situation that we find ourselves in at the tail end of the scientific industrial era.
The last-ditch attempt at control and manipulation of the population, and that this COVID-19 and associated crisis at the moment are somehow part of that picture, whether designed that way or made use of that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly very clear to me that, and this is an inbuilt aspect of the value set from Layer 5, is it will exploit whatever it can. It will look for opportunity at everything. And so even in the face of a crisis, it will stop and think, how can I actually come out of this in front? What can I put my money on, or what can I invest in? What service can I provide in order to actually make money out of this? It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a crisis or something else. So that is the value set. That's where it comes from. And a lot of what Icke was saying is simply addressing that and recognising that, albeit presented in quite a sinister way, for sure. But the main issue, that, as we're saying, is that what's happened, according to Brian Rose, and this is provided that what his perspective on it is accurate, he said that the BBC made a request to YouTube to take down his interview with David Icke, and then, of course, it was subsequently censored, taken down, and he uploaded it again. They took it down again, and he also said that he was a front page story in BBC News.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder David Icke's a good example because he is out on a limb. A lot of what he says for many years is pretty out there. But I do wonder what is seen to be actually damaging in what he is saying in that video.
Well, I can give you one very concrete example, and that is his talk about the fears around 5G technology.
Yeah.
And let me say, first and foremost, that, again, the exploitational aspect of the modern value set means that it doesn't matter what you're talking about, they'll look for opportunity within it. And so from a defence point of view and an international conflict perspective, any social system that can offer an advantage in a war will be taken advantage of. And we know for a fact that this has been reported so many times in the mainstream media, that our old 4G telephone system has been used for targeting missiles.
Yeah.
And also for tracking terrorists.
And face recognition in China.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a fact. You can't dispute those things. It's very, very well established.
So a more sophisticated system, a more a rolled out system across the planet is going to have much more potential for use and misuse.
Yeah, and if you think that 5G would be released without that old value system exploiting every opportunity it provides to use it in a military or social control role, then you're just not thinking realistically. I mean, it's basically an aspect of the value system that is going to guarantee that it will look to do those things. Now, what that means in practice, I can't say. There are many, many different things being asserted out there and claimed.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the 5G and coronavirus linkage is dubious. And I have heard, can't find any reference to it directly, but I have heard that this may well be a marketing project of the 5G companies to conflate these two issues, to make it seem like anybody who's objecting to 5G is a crazy. And that may well be exactly what's going on also, or an aspect of it.
Yeah, just getting back to the original thing that prompted my response, though, the one thing that has been happening in the UK is that there have been a few 5G towers which have been set on fire, right? And putting our kind of very, very sensible mainstream hat on for a moment,
not the tinfoil hat this time, guys.
It's really not a good idea to have people burning down phone towers because, people rely on these sometimes for life and death issues to make a 000 call, for example, an emergency call, and call an ambulance and those sorts of things. The last thing you want is to find out that the local phone tower has been burnt down, and you can't do that. So there are really, really, really good reasons for the government to want to stop the spread of those kinds of ideas. So that is one reason why mainstream might not want that David Icke thing going to air.
Those people burning down 5G towers, for example, I mean, what layer of consciousness, just as a little aside here, would they be operating from? Because clearly they're probably imagining themselves as green, green terrorists almost, but that's contrary to...
That's a contradiction in terms. Yeah. It's most likely, I mean, really it's impossible to say for sure what value system they're operating from. I mean, it's certainly fair to say that they're under a lot of stress and they're feeling highly motivated to take it out on the towers. It's most likely coming from a value system that is driven to take radical and perhaps ill-considered actions. In which case that would be layer 3. But it could also be coming from a very strategically organised and complex and intentional plan, which could be from layer 5, right? I mean, thinking about the way that layer 5 fights wars now, for example, and the acme, the pinnacle of war fighting today is to fight a war where people don't even recognise that you're fighting a war. And so you're damaging your opponent, you're winning in various different measures, but there's no war been declared, and so your opponent can't turn around and fire a missile at you without looking like it's them who's starting the war, and that's the way things work at the moment. So it's complex and it's difficult and it's a great challenge, but it's really important to understand that there are always different sides to the story.
Yeah. We'll take a short break here. We'll be back with the last part of the show here on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans on Bay FM 99.9 or via futuresense.it and the podcast listening out there all around the world. Thanks for joining us.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
You're listening to Future Sense, and we're talking about the impact of the media on our capacity to make sense of what's going on globally at the moment and also to make informed responses and act accordingly. And we're just talking about the nature of the old value system, the scientific industrial value system, which is in decline at the moment, and how it likes to exploit things and use them for personal advantage. And another example of that, which has just been reported in the media in the last couple of days, is that the companies Apple and Google are building tracking technology into both of their operating systems, so iOS and Android, for the purposes of being able to track who you've come into contact with and also to alert those same people should you suddenly come down with the virus.
They're releasing this in May. It's right now.
Yeah, it's very real and very now. And I watched a small part of an interview with Edward Snowden yesterday where he was talking about this same tendency of the old paradigm to exploit whatever it can to advantage. And he just made the point that whenever in the past there's been some sort of global emergency or crisis and there's been a promise of introducing legislation to deal with it or technology to deal with it, almost without exception, those pieces of legislation and technology have never been wound back once the crisis or emergency subsides. And we ought to be very aware of that. And, it really is a difficult choice sometimes because there are pros and cons. This is never a black and white kind of a situation. I mean, look at China's response to COVID-19 in the early days where they used their surveillance technology to good advantage to fairly quickly deal with the outbreak. And as I said earlier in the show, it's not the technology or the system itself which has any moral nature. It's really the people who design it, the people who roll them out, the people who use them and control them. They're the ones with the morals, and they're the ones that we need to look very closely at and sometimes question.
Indeed. I think that's exactly the point that we are on in this crisis and in this time of transformation and change, is to look very carefully at just that. Who is using these technologies? Who is designing them? And how are they going to be implemented? And who's in control of them? And those questions can be asked around a number of issues that are arising, vaccinations and other. We might come to that today as well.
Yeah. And the paradigm shift trend is taking us towards decentralisation of power, which means empowerment of individuals and local communities. And so if we're going to introduce any new system or any new technology now, we should make sure that it has free choice built into it, that people can opt in or they can opt out, and that we can trust the people who are making the technology, to tell us the truth about what the technology can do and how it's going to be used. Because, and this ties back into the media stuff. I mean, the whole modern era has been characterised to some extent about what's not being said, what's not reported, and those agendas that sit behind the scenes.
There's another piece from MIT News from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Storing medical information below the skin's surface. Specialised dye delivered along with the vaccine could enable on-patient storage of vaccination history. So this is a whole other area. And again, the implications for personal choice here, the implications of world health, the implications of technology that's implanted in you. And there are people who've already got these kind of chips implanted. I saw a video of someone who actually has something implanted in his wrist.
Yeah, I saw that too, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole right there that we could easily do a whole show on. And it is a great concern, but again, it's to be expected. These things are predictable when you understand the value systems that are driving them. And the wonderful thing about just talking about value systems is you don't really have to name names or organisations. We're just talking about a particular way of being human here that's recognisable by the way it makes choices and the things that motivate it, basically. And so... the medical profession is clearly in an opportune position here with this global outbreak to quite possibly profit considerably from whatever kind of response happens. And there's, a bit of a dissonance going on at the moment with the statistics showing us that in many countries now the threat is subsiding, in particular here in Australia, where we've done, relatively very well compared to many, many other countries. I mean, as of the day of recording today, the 12th of April, we've got around about 6,300 cases out of a population of 24.6 million people and only 59 deaths, which is, rather small compared to many, many other countries.
And that's 1%, which is a very small percentage too of deaths of the registered cases.
Yeah, and of course the growth, the expression of this virus in different places around the world is stagnant, and so some countries like the US, for example, are sort of just probably still approaching their peak at the moment, and yet to go through it, and also their casualty count is percentage-wise higher than many other countries at the moment too. But everywhere around the world, and we've been saying this for weeks now, everywhere around the world where there is an unusually high casualty count attributed to COVID-19, there's been very specific reasons for that, whether it's an elderly population, whether it's a health system that's not very well equipped to cope with what's going on, or other very specific reasons. But every time there has been a reason. And this is one of the things that typically has not been reported in the mainstream media. And you really need to ask why. Even our own ABC here in Australia, a story that I read in the last couple of days reporting about a high casualty count in New Orleans and interviewing an Australian doctor who's working there was no attempt to even explain why New Orleans might have a different experience than other places. It was just all about warning Australia that you ought to really take notice of this and don't get complacent and, be afraid, basically.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that simplification of the complexity that is being perpetrated by the news media, conventional news media, is a real issue, isn't it? Because what we need to be doing is actually starting to look at that complexity and not just get the simple version that we go, oh, yeah, okay.
No, that's right. Yeah. And, it doesn't take long to do a bit of digging and find out that, okay, New Orleans has a very big African-American population, who are also generally, and this probably applies, to much of the USA, in more difficult life conditions in terms of their socioeconomic capacity and those sorts of things. And so that puts them in a high risk factor. So that goes part of the way, at least, to explaining why there might be more casualties in New Orleans.
Exactly.
But why isn't the mainstream media doing this? And, is it because they're just ignorant and that the the depletion of our mainstream media's investigative reporting capacity and maybe perhaps the automation of the editing process and those sorts of things probably added to that somewhat. But it also, given the tendency of the old paradigm to obscure information, it absolutely feeds into the conspiracy theory thinking. It really does.
Yeah. On that, there is a piece in Science News entitled Why African Americans May Be Especially Vulnerable to COVID-19, and it's particularly those socioeconomic factors, underlying health conditions and the like that make different populations more or less susceptible to these kind of things. And it's an important nuance. It's something that should be factored into the way that we deal with this crisis in any particular locality.
Absolutely, and it should be shaping our response right around the world. I mean, coming up with a plan and putting it in place and then walking away makes no sense whatsoever. Plans need to be alive and dynamic, and we should constantly be gathering all the relevant information and using that to shape the way that we address this pandemic. And that has typically not been happening according to what's being reported in the media anyway. I mean, even here in Australia, where we've been, I think, relatively successful in bringing this under control, we've still had a blanket response. There's been lots of really good information out there about who is most vulnerable within society. We have good data on where these cases have come from, with the majority of the cases in the country coming from people who have come off cruise ships or travelling from overseas. And so why is it then that we've maintained a blanket one-size-fits-all response? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it doesn't make a lot of sense if you choose to look at and report the impact of the economic disruption, which is something, again, this is one of the things that's not being spoken about. And I'm talking about changes to mental health, increases in domestic violence, simple things like people's inability to obtain medications or medical treatment that they would normally be able to obtain when the lockdown wasn't in place. And I mean, even you fall into this category, Nick.
Yeah.
People who've had surgery delayed, and the list goes on. But this is all information where we don't have a casualty count, for example, of the increase in suicide or domestic violence deaths.
Well, I've got a piece here, a couple of pieces from Scientific American and also from Reuters. Yeah, and this is interesting statistics. In Europe and the United States, suicide rates rise about 1% for every 1 percentage point increase in unemployment, according to research published by lead author Aaron Reeves from Oxford University. And of course, 16 million people have lost their jobs in America, probably more than that, but 16 million have gone on to unemployment benefits. So that's a rise, a big rise right there. During the last recession, when the unemployment in the United States peaked at 10%, the suicide rate jumped, resulting in 4,750 more deaths. If the unemployment rate increases to 20%, the toll could well rise. And the longer the suppression lasts, history shows, the worse such outcomes will be. A surge of unemployment in 1982 cut the lifespans of Americans by a collective 2 to 3 million years, researchers found. During the last recession from 2007 to 2009, the bleak job market helped spike suicide rates in the United States and Europe, claiming the lives of 10,000 more people than prior to the downturn, etc., etc. So, the lives that are lost from the virus itself is one thing, but the lives that may and will be lost from the knock-on effects, such as mental health, these sort of mental health issues, and many other things, as you said, as you alluded to, also the inability to access normal supplies of medications or hospital visits and so forth that some people are experiencing. This article finishes talking about we should immediately establish mental health initiatives focusing on educating the public and healthcare workers on how to best deal with the immense pressure and anxiety. This may help minimise the psychosocial toll in these times of crisis. We should also implement targeted mental health surveillance of populations at risk, and so on. So it's pretty obvious, and I think a lot of these things are beginning to be looked at, but they're sort of down the wish list at the moment in dealing with the very large health and mental health and social issues that are going to accrue from this.
Yeah, and we really need to be asking, why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't these things being reported in the media? Why aren't we counting these numbers? The fact that we're getting fed a very, very narrow story, which is very focused on COVID-19 and seems to be feeding fear quite intentionally, that actually feeds into the whole conspiracy theory issue. And so it's likely to breed more conspiracy theories, more unrest.
Good point.
As we said in the show last week, the next big risk that we see globally is civil unrest, because having people locked down and fed a very, very narrow storyline is not sustainable. People will not put up with that for very long. And for the emerging paradigm, it's a very, very peaceful way of being human. The most likely thing that we're going to see from the emerging paradigm is some kind of peaceful civil disobedience. It's people simply deciding en masse not to follow the rules. Not to go out there and burn or destroy anything, but just simply to stop following the rules.
Which we've really seen in the last few years, the new movements such as Extinction Rebellion, the Yellow Vests and others that have generally been, other than a few sort of people who sort of incite things, been generally peaceful. But that idea of a peaceful protest in a different way than ever has been before is in the zeitgeist now.
Absolutely, it is, and it's quite likely that we're going to see more of it. Before we wrap up the show, Nick, I'd just like to mention that New Zealand, in particular, is making plans to come out of lockdown. I have a media story published by the New Zealand Herald today, 12th of April. Headlined, COVID-19 coronavirus, schools could resume from April 29 if lockdown lifted. And I'm just going to read from the story. Schools are being advised they could reopen to some students by April 29 if the lockdown is lifted on April 20. New Zealand Education Minister Chris Hipkins said this morning he wanted to keep expectations reasonable and stressed the decision would be based on public health advice. After the lockdown was lifted and New Zealand went back to level 3, it would take some time for schools to prepare for children to come back. And as an aside, I think that's a very important consideration, is that having shut down much of society, there will be a ramp-up time required, for things to return to normal once again, particularly in things like supply chains that could be running over long distances.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be complex to actually unroll what's been rolled up.
Absolutely, and the longer that the lockdown stays in place, the more complex and difficult it will be to ramp it up again. I'm thinking also of the airline industry, where Virgin Australia a couple of days ago announced that they were pretty much going to stop domestic flights within Australia, apart from a few flights from Melbourne and Sydney. And, when you've got a complex industry like aviation and you shut it down for a period of time, there are all sorts of implications in terms of pilot skills and aircraft maintenance and those sorts of things which come into play, which make it, not so easy to start up again. So this is a real key consideration, and it's part of the reason why I've been saying for a while now that this really has a limited use by date. This lockdown, it's not going to be sustainable. It's just going to cause much bigger problems if it keeps going on and on and on.
We've seen an incredible decrease in crime rates around the world too, to sort of throw that in, as you may have heard or read out there, folks. Most of the major cities and countries in the world have reported incredible drops in crime levels across the board in society. And it obviously makes sense. And I guess if people are stealing things, they're not going to be able to sell them off either. Or do anything really.
I know. Yeah, there's definitely a whole range of upsides as well as downsides, that's for sure. Which fits with the the total big picture global shift of some stuff collapsing and other stuff
and
rising.
It's really important, as we said in the beginning, in this new paradigm that we're entering, that it is a complexified region of being that we're entering, and there are negatives and there are positives to everything, and it's good to be able to consider as many of them as we can to find out what to steer a path to actually what works to solve the problems that we need to address now.
Yeah, and just bear in mind that all of the people and the institutions associated with the old paradigm, they really want to hang on to the old, so they're going to go out of their way now, and things are going to get more extreme, in their attempts to do that. And the opportunity is there, though. The window is open for this new paradigm to stand up and for people to start making choices, organising themselves and acting from these new value sets.
Many people who are familiar with literature would probably know Albert Camus' book, The Plague. And in The Plague, Camus questions through his main character, physician Bernard Roux, whether in the aftermath of such suffering, humanity can find a peace of mind. And offering a glimpse of hope, Camus concludes that we can, as, quote, If there is one thing one can always yearn for and sometimes attain, it is human love.
Absolutely. Beautiful thought, Dick. Perhaps a good one to end on this week.
I think so. Lovely. Thanks for joining us here on Future Sense. Steve McDonald, Nick Jeans signing out, and we will be with you next week. And as I've been saying, of course, the podcast is available in the next 24 hours ago, also from the broadcast as you're hearing it now. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.